The federal government will release its highly anticipated budget on April the 19th. Now, this will give Canadians a detailed account of pandemic spending and how the Liberals plan to spend billions more on the road to economic recovery. To talk about this in a little more detail is our political reporter, Brian Lilley, joining me once again from Toronto. Brian, this will be the first budget in what, more than 2 years?
It will be more than 2 years by the time that the Trudeau Liberals bring the budget down. And I'm old enough to remember when the Trudeau Liberals were denouncing the Harper Conservatives for bringing in a budget. I think it was around April 20th. Maybe the one day makes a difference and it's all fine now, but they thought it was far too late. Well, they skipped doing a budget last year. I think all the provinces did eventually. Some of them were late, like Ontario's was in November, but they all brought in budgets and managed to do this. The Trudeau Liberals have been spending at breakneck pace. The deficit now bigger than budgets used to be only a few short years ago. Wow. And we don't know where all the spending has been going. So this is more than just a theoretical exercise or parliamentary tradition. This is how the opposition, how the media, how the public gets a sense of what's going on. And then once the budget's tabled, you get all the other layers of checks and balances on government spending. Are they spending the way they promised? Are they overspending? Are they is the money that they said was allocated to a certain measure actually being spent? You know, oftentimes you hear governments make grand announcements of what they're going to do, and then you go into the public accounts or the estimates later on and you find out that money never went anywhere. Well, these are the types of things that we need to be able to do if we're going to hold this government or any government to account. So it's very important. I'm expecting a big spending budget that will be the prelude to an election, because I'm still on the team that says we're going to a spring election.
And what many people have to realize as well, these are taxpayers' dollars, so that's not free money. The money has to be paid back. Brian, federal Conservative leader Erin O'Toole has called on the federal government to present a strategy for reopening the economy around 3 weeks after passage. You know, something has to give. Thousands of Canadian businesses going under, including thousands of restaurants.
Restaurants, bars, gyms, personal service, you know, the hair salons, the barbershops, the nail salons, all of these places that haven't been able to operate or haven't been able to operate fully. It all depends on where you live and what the restrictions are like. And while these are provincial and at times municipal restrictions that are put in place, the Conservatives' argument is kind of twofold. One, the federal government is the leader in the pandemic response. Two, they have at times called for further restrictions. They're still saying it's not time to lift restrictions. So the Conservatives are saying, tell us when, show us a plan. How will it work? And will that include, you know, how vaccines are being rolled out across the country, which is still quite a mess. So I think this is a good idea. Will the Liberals listen? Will the opposition parties join in? I don't know. There's still many Canadians who say it's too soon to reopen and we should just keep shut down. Well, I don't think that that's going to stand for most Canadians as the weather gets warmer and the days get longer.
The federal Conservatives held their convention recently, Brian, and despite things going fairly well, a lot of the mainstream media coverage is about an issue the Liberals want to fight the Tories on, which is climate change.
Yes, all the focus is about how Erin O'Toole gave a great speech, but those knuckle-dragging Conservatives voted to deny that climate change is real, which of course is not actually a thing. I'm sure there were people participating in the convention who would like to vote and say, no, climate change isn't real, it's not happening, or if it is happening, I welcome it, you know, variety of things. But here's what really went down. There were a number of environmental measures discussed in the policy side of the vote. And unlike other parties, the Conservatives, well, unlike the Liberals, the Conservatives allow the membership to vote on party policy. Now, does that mean that's going to be in the platform or that's what the leader will focus on? No, but they at least get to debate and talk about the policy. And they've already voted in numerous times at past conventions, including recent ones, that climate change is real. There was an attempt to put it in again into the policy document, and some people said, why are we putting it in a second time? We're not going to repeat ourselves. That's what really went down. But look, bottom line, we heard for weeks that the Conservative convention was going to be a disaster, that Erin O'Toole was losing control of his party, that nothing good was going to happen. he had a good convention. He had a good speech. It's tough to tell how the audience was reacting to it because he's almost alone in a room delivering the speech to no one, giving it virtually, and people are sitting at home watching on screens like this one as to whether or not they like it. So it doesn't have the same feel, but overall I'd say Aaron O'Toole hit the right marks coming out of this virtual convention.
So, Brian, many people are wondering, though, because it appears that the Conservatives have gone a little bit to the left, so they're more of a centrist party, that they're actually liberal light. Are there any fundamental differences between the Conservatives and the Liberals right now?
I would argue that there are. And look, in leadership races, parties go towards their fringes into the sides, and then in an attempt to win the election, they have to appeal to voters who are in the center. And that's what Aaron O'Toole is doing. It's standard political playbook, whether we're talking the conservatives here, Republicans in the States, the New Democrats will do that on the left side of the spectrum. The liberals, to a degree as well, they'll campaign very left and then come in and try and win over the voters who are in the mushy middle. Because a lot of people are set in their ways of who they're voting for, but there's a core of people who float around, and those are the ones you've got to win over if you're going to seize power. Now, what are the differences? Well, Aaron O'Toole has been looking for a more free market way of dealing with the economy in terms of helping people. His calls in terms of pandemic response have not been you're spending too much or we need to spend more. It's we've got to spend it in the right way. He's also been harder on China than Justin Trudeau has been, and he has been for many years. It's not a trendy thing for him. So there are a number of differences between him and the Liberals, and to say that he is just Justin Trudeau light, I think does him and the party a disservice.
And he's also been a big supporter of the energy sector as well, where the Liberals may not have been so much, especially out here in the West, right? Now let's talk about vaccines for just a moment, Brian, in particular, the AstraZeneca shot, which many people had serious concerns about. The U.S. regulator says AstraZeneca may have included outdated information when released clinical trial results. Can you explain?
Yeah, and it's not that the data can't be used, it's that they needed more up-to-date data. So, it was from earlier in the trials. AstraZeneca has a real bad PR problem going on, which is too bad because when you look at the real world examples of it being used, as it has been extensively in Britain, it's doing very well, keeping people over the age of 80 out of the hospital and from dying. It's doing remarkably well. And that's what you want a vaccine for this type of thing to do. Keep people out of the hospital, reduce the death count that we all saw was going on with COVID-19. But they've had issues around the United States approval. They've had claims that it wasn't safe for people over 65 just because of the way that the clinical trials were done. They had a bunch of countries say that, European Union countries say that they weren't going to use it because of fears of clotting. Then they walked it back. Now they're demanding that they get more of it. There's a lot of politics at play, especially between the EU and Britain, where AstraZeneca was and the University of Oxford developed the vaccine. There's a lot of politics between the EU and Britain over this that unfortunately I think is going to lead to a lot of people being scared or concerned about taking this particular vaccine. I've had people email me saying, I'm not taking that garbage, I'm waiting for the good stuff. I've heard from others who say, you know what, I'll take the first vaccine that's offered to me. I want to have this thing over with.
Now, Brian, Canada could soon get 1.5 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine from the United States. The U.S. says it doesn't need it. Now, this is on top of more than 1 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine this week? Is it safe to say that we're slowly catching up with other countries when it comes to a healthy supply of vaccines?
Not quite yet, and the key word there would be slowly. Look, this is a big improvement from 6 weeks ago when we were getting 0 doses delivered some weeks, or we were getting just a fraction of what had been promised. We are slowly ramping up, and that's a good thing. And despite claims that some premiers, and it always seems to be the conservative ones that they claim are sitting on leaving vaccines in freezers, it's not true. They're using them at a responsible pace. In Alberta, in Ontario, most of the provinces are going at a reasonable and responsible pace without running out. And I'll give you an example of why Saskatchewan was perhaps one of the more aggressive ones in trying to get needles into arms and use up doses as fast as possible. Last week, we found out that Moderna We were expecting just shy of 900,000 doses of Moderna this week, and appointments had been booked. Well, the provinces are only getting 30% of their promised doses, and the other 70% is showing up next week. That meant that Saskatchewan had to rebook tens of thousands of appointments because they are being more aggressive. Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, they're still being aggressive. They're still, by the time the next shipment is showing up, they've used more than 90% of the doses, but they're going a bit slower so that when events like this happen, they're not calling up Granny and saying, you can't come in on Tuesday, you can't come in on Thursday. And they're just trying to go. The vaccines are showing up at irregular intervals. For example, this week, Pfizer showed up on Monday. A couple of weeks ago, it showed up on the Friday. And the provinces have to be ready and manage this properly so that there's no interruption.
Brian, as MPs continue to probe allegations of sexual misconduct surrounding former Chief of Defence Staff General Jonathan Vance, a former aide to former PM Stephen Harper says Vance was not truthful when questioned about the allegations back in 2015.
And back in 2015, when an ad hoc committee had recommended to then Prime Minister Stephen Harper that General Jonathan Vance become the next Chief of Defence Staff, the allegation was not the one that we're dealing with now. The allegation was that in 2013-14, he'd had a relationship with a woman under his command, but from the American military. And Harper asked him about it because this had been raised as a possible issue. Well, Vance was able to inform the Prime Minister, yes, I was in a relationship with a woman when I was stationed at the Joint Command Base in Naples, Italy. That woman's now my fiance. That seemed to settle it. Harper asked, is there anything else I should know about? He said no. And that's where Ray Novak, Harper's former chief of staff, who was in the room at the time, says, if these allegations are true, then Vance did not tell the truth to the Prime Minister. There were other rumors at the time about various things, but nothing that the government was able to, discover through investigation. They asked then National Security Director Richard Fadden to look into it. They couldn't find the name of a woman to complain, so they moved on. The allegations took on a bit more weight later on, and instead of investigating them, the Trudeau government gave Vance a pay raise.
Both of the Canadian Michael, Spavor and Kovrig had their secret trials in China. Both were charged with spying, Brian. What do we know about what went on during the trials, and what will the outcome be? I mean, is this really a death sentence for both of the two Michaels?
We know very little about what went on because the trials were held in secret. The Canadian officials weren't allowed in. There was a good show of foreign diplomats coming out to show support, but as far as what the allegations are, how the trial went, we don't really know. Now, there are some analysts like Charles Burton from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who I've interviewed many times, a very smart guy, used to be a diplomat for Canada in China, knows the situation. He is hopeful that the fact that they've brought them to trial might mean that China no longer sees a political use in having Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor in custody, that perhaps they're doing this so that they can say, we've tried them, we found them guilty, and we're sending them back to Canada. That's his hope, and that would be the best outcome, because they're no longer useful in the fight by China to try and get Ms. Meng, the Huawei CFO, freed. So we can hope for that, and we can hope that this continuing pressure from other countries does take hold.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the support that Canada's received from some of the other countries. What has really changed here?
I think what has changed is more than a year of diplomacy by the Trudeau government. I'll give them great credit on that, in trying to get other countries to sign on to a document that singled out China, and they did that. A change in U.S. administration. The Trump administration was no friend of China. In fact, they were fighting with them often. Joe Biden is taking a different tact. He is trying to rebuild the relationship, but at the same time, treating these two Canadians as if they're Americans and demanding that they be released. So China is also under a lot of pressure on issues like the Uyghur genocide and others, and they're starting to feel the pinch internationally. So they're lashing out. They're again accusing Canada of genocide against First Nations people. They're trying to claim that Canada is worse than China. We all know that's not true, but that's the position they're in. They're feeling the heat and from the international community in a way that they haven't before.
Let's hope that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor can make it home safe and sound. Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.